The coffee-stained uniform and tired eyes of a small-town diner. Waitress became the unlikely disguise for the most decorated female pilot in Air Force history, until the day terrorists seized Millbrook's nuclear facility, and only she had the skills to stop a catastrophe that would kill 50,000 people. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The emergency klaxon screamed across Millbrook Valley at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like any other. Dakota Riley was balancing 3 plates of meatloaf and mashed potatoes when the piercing wail cut through the afternoon chatter at Rusty's Roadside Diner. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze halfway to mouths. The sound that every resident of Millbrook, Montana had dreaded for the past 15 years was finally happening. The Millbrook Nuclear Research Facility was in full emergency lockdown. Through the diner's grease-streaked windows, Dakota could see the mushroom cloud of black smoke rising from the direction of the facility, just 8 miles northeast of town. Her hands remained steady as she set down the plates, muscle memory from a different life taking over, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The customers around her began to panic, voices rising, chairs scraping against linoleum as people rushed toward the windows. "Jesus Christ, is that the nuclear plant?" shouted Tommy Brennan, the local mechanic who'd been hitting on Dakota unsuccessfully for 3 months. His face had gone white beneath his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. "Everyone, stay calm," Dakota said automatically, but her mind was already racing through protocols she hadn't thought about in 5 years. Emergency response procedures, evacuation routes, blast radius calculations. The kind of information that a diner waitress in small-town Montana had no business knowing. Her radio crackled to life, not the cheap transistor radio behind the counter, but the military-grade communication device she kept hidden in her apron pocket. A device that officially didn't exist, connected to a network that officially had been deactivated when she'd been dishonorably discharged from the United States Air Force. "Ghost Rider, this is Mountain Home Base," came the encrypted voice that made Dakota's blood freeze. "Emergency authentication Alpha-7-7-Charlie. Respond immediately." Ghost Rider, the call sign she hadn't heard in 5 years. The call sign that belonged to Captain Dakota Riley, not the broken-down waitress who served coffee and endured condescending smiles from truckers who called her sweetheart and left 50-cent tips. Dakota stepped into the diner's storage room, pulling the radio from her pocket with hands that betrayed nothing of the earthquake happening inside her chest. Around her, cases of ketchup and industrial-sized cans of green beans created a makeshift bunker where she could speak without being overheard. "Mountain Home, this is Ghost Rider," she whispered into the device. "Authentication confirmed. What's your status?" "Ghost Rider, we have a code black situation at Millbrook Nuclear Research Facility. Terrorist cell has seized control of the main reactor. Preliminary intelligence suggests they're attempting to trigger a meltdown that would create a radiological disaster affecting a 50-mile radius." Dakota's legs nearly gave out. 50 miles would encompass not just Millbrook's 12,000 residents, but 3 other towns, 2 Native American reservations, and 250,000 acres of pristine wilderness. It would be the worst nuclear disaster in American history. "What's the military response?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Negative on conventional response. Facility is equipped with surface-to-air missile systems that were compromised during the initial attack. No helicopter or conventional aircraft can approach within 10 miles. Jets can't fly low enough for precision strikes without triggering the automated defense grid." Dakota closed her eyes, seeing the tactical situation with the clarity that had once made her the youngest pilot ever selected for the Air Force's most classified missions. The Millbrook facility had been designed to be impregnable, protected by the most advanced air defense system ever deployed at a civilian installation. It was meant to keep enemies out. Now it was keeping rescue forces out. Ghost Rider, we're transmitting current facility schematics to your position. Intel suggests the terrorists have a 12-hour window to complete their objective. After that, the meltdown becomes irreversible. 12 hours. Dakota looked at her watch. 3:52 p.m. By 3:52 a.m. tomorrow morning, everyone she'd served coffee to for the past 3 years would be dead, along with 50,000 other innocent people. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said, though her pilot's brain was already running calculations, wind speed and direction, approach vectors, the precise angle needed to slip under radar coverage. There's a single-seat F-35B Lightning II at Malmstrom Air Force Base, 180 miles southeast of your position. Vertical landing capability. Advanced stealth technology. It's the only aircraft with the capability to penetrate the facility's defenses and deliver a precision strike to disable the reactor cooling systems before meltdown occurs. Dakota's hand tightened on the radio. The F-35B was the most advanced fighter jet in the world, equipped with technology that made it virtually invisible to radar and capable of landing like a helicopter. She'd flown the prototypes during her classified missions, back when she'd been the Air Force's golden girl, instead of a disgraced ex-pilot slinging hash in a roadside diner. Mountain Home, you're talking about a mission that requires clearance levels I no longer possess. Flying an aircraft I'm not authorized to touch, conducting an unauthorized strike on American soil. Ghost Rider, you're the only pilot within 500 miles with F-35B experience and the security clearance to understand what we're dealing with. The President has authorized this mission under national emergency protocols. Through the storage room door, Dakota could hear the panic escalating in the diner. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting about evacuation routes. Tommy Brennan was demanding to know why the damn government wasn't doing anything. If they only knew that the damn government was asking a washed-up waitress to steal a $100 million fighter jet and conduct a solo mission that would make the Doolittle raid look like a training exercise. What about civilian casualties at the facility? Dakota asked. Intelligence suggests approximately 200 hostages, including the facility's entire research staff. The terrorist cell is well armed and has threatened to execute hostages if any rescue attempt is made. So not only did she have to penetrate the most advanced air defense system in the world, she had to do it without triggering a massacre of innocent civilians. And she had to do it while flying an aircraft she hadn't touched in 5 years, using skills that had been systematically destroyed by 3 years of serving coffee and pretending she was nobody special. Ghost Rider, we need your answer. Every minute we delay increases the likelihood of catastrophic failure. Dakota looked through the crack in the storage room door at the people she'd been serving for 3 years. Mrs. Henderson, the elementary school teacher who always ordered decaf and left religious pamphlets as tips. Young Billy Martinez, home from college, who still called her Miss Dakota like he had when he was 8 years old. Tommy Brennan, whose clumsy flirtations had been the closest thing to romance in her life since the court-martial. These people had never known who she really was. To them, she was just Dakota the waitress, reliable, forgettable, safely ordinary. They had no idea that the woman who refilled their coffee cups had once been capable of flying missions that could change the course of wars. They were about to find out. Mountain Home, she said into the radio. Ghost Rider is mission ready. Send me those schematics and prep that bird. I'm coming home. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dakota stared at the encrypted tablet that had been covertly delivered to the diner's back alley. 20 minutes after her radio conversation with Mountain Home Base, the device displayed 2 paths that would define not just her future, but the fate of everyone within 50 miles of Millbrook. Option 1 was simple. Stay Dakota the waitress. Keep serving coffee, keep her head down, keep pretending that Captain Dakota Riley had never existed. Let the military handle the crisis through official channels. Wait for the evacuation orders that might or might not come in time. Trust that someone else would find a way to save 50,000 innocent lives without asking a disgraced ex-pilot to risk everything again. Option 2 was insane. Drive 180 miles to Malmstrom Air Force Base. Somehow gain access to one of the most secure military installations in America. Steal a $100 million F-35B Lightning II. And conduct an unauthorized solo mission that would either save her town or turn her into a terrorist herself. The tablet screen showed real-time footage from news helicopters circling the Millbrook Nuclear Research Facility at a safe distance. Black smoke continued to pour from multiple buildings. Emergency vehicles lined the perimeter road, their flashing lights creating a deadly light show against the Montana afternoon sky. But most terrifying of all were the surface-to-air missile batteries visible on the facility's rooftops, sleek, deadly sentinels that had already locked onto and turned away 3 attempted helicopter rescues. "Dakota, what the hell are you doing? Back there?" Rusty Pemberton's gravelly voice cut through her concentration. The diner's owner pushed through the storage room door, his weathered face flushed with anxiety. "We got customers out here scared out of their minds, and you're hiding in the damn pantry." She quickly closed the tablet and slipped it behind a case of coffee filters. "Sorry, Rusty, just needed a moment to collect myself." Rusty's expression softened slightly. At 62, he'd owned the diner for 30 years and had developed. Option 1 was simple. Stay Dakota the waitress. Keep serving coffee, keep her head down, keep pretending that Captain Dakota Riley had never existed. Let the military handle the crisis through official channels. Wait for the evacuation orders that might or might not come in time. Trust that someone else would find a way to save 50,000 innocent lives without asking a disgraced ex-pilot to risk everything again. Option 2 was insane. Drive 180 miles to Malmstrom Air Force Base. Somehow gain access to one of the most secure military installations in America. Steal a $100 million F-35B Lightning II. And conduct an unauthorized solo mission that would either save her town or turn her into a terrorist herself. The tablet screen showed real-time footage from news helicopters circling the Millbrook Nuclear Research Facility at a safe distance. Black smoke continued to pour from multiple buildings. Emergency vehicles lined the perimeter road, their flashing lights creating a deadly light show against the Montana afternoon sky. But most terrifying of all were the surface-to-air missile batteries visible on the facility's rooftops, sleek, deadly sentinels that had already locked onto and turned away 3 attempted helicopter rescues. "Dakota, what the hell are you doing? Back there?" Rusty Pemberton's gravelly voice cut through her concentration. The diner's owner pushed through the storage room door, his weathered face flushed with anxiety. "We got customers out here scared out of their minds, and you're hiding in the damn pantry." She quickly closed the tablet and slipped it behind a case of coffee filters. "Sorry, Rusty, just needed a moment to collect myself." Rusty's expression softened slightly. At 62, he'd owned the diner for 30 years and had developed an almost paternal relationship with his employees. "Look, I know this is scary as hell. My wife's already packing our bags, talking about driving to her sister's place in Billings. Maybe you should think about getting out of town too." Dakota looked at this man who'd given her a job when nobody else would, who'd never asked questions about her past or why someone with her obvious intelligence was content to serve coffee for $8.50 an hour plus tips, who'd let her work extra shifts when her rent was due and never complained when she occasionally disappeared for what she called personal emergencies, but were actually mandatory. Psychological evaluations required by her discharge agreement. "Rusty," she said carefully, "what if I told you there might be a way to stop this? To save the town without waiting for evacuation orders that might never come?" He studied her face with the shrewdness that had kept his small business afloat. "For 3 decades. I'd say you're talking like someone who knows a hell of a lot more about military operations than any waitress should." The moment hung between them like a loaded weapon. Dakota had spent 3 years in Millbrook carefully constructing the fiction that she was nobody special. Now she was contemplating destroying that fiction to save lives before she could respond. The diner's front door exploded open with a bang that made both of them jump. Tommy Brennan burst through, his mechanic's coveralls streaked with grease and his eyes wild with panic. "They're saying on the radio that this could be worse than Chernobyl." He shouted to the room. "Government's got no way to get in there. We're all gonna die while they figure out what the hell to do." Mrs. Henderson, still clutching her coffee cup with trembling hands, looked up at him with the same expression Dakota had seen on the faces of civilians in war zones. "Tommy, please. You're scaring the children." Dakota noticed for the first time that Billy Martinez wasn't alone. His 8-year-old sister Carmen was with him, apparently picked up from school when the emergency began. The little girl who'd always brightened when Dakota brought her chocolate chip pancakes was now pressed against her brother's side, tears streaming down her face. "Miss Dakota," Carmen whispered when she saw her, "are the bad men going to hurt U.S.?" The question hit Dakota like a physical blow. She knelt down to Carmen's eye level, seeing in the child's frightened face every civilian she'd ever been sworn to protect. Every mission brief that had begun with the phrase, "American lives are at stake." "Not if I can help it, sweetheart," Dakota said softly. Tommy Brennan let out a bitter laugh. "Right, what's a waitress gonna do? Call Superman?" The condescension in his voice, the same tone she'd endured from him for months, suddenly crystallized everything Dakota had been wrestling with. Tommy had no idea that the woman he'd been trying to impress with his mechanical knowledge had once been responsible for maintaining aircraft systems far more complex than anything in his garage. He didn't know that her clumsy handling of the diner's temperamental coffee machine was actually the careful movements of someone who'd once performed precision maintenance on fighter jets worth more than his entire business. "You know what, Tommy?" Dakota stood up, her voice carrying an edge that made several customers look in her direction. "Maybe some of us are more capable than we appear. What's that supposed to mean?" Dakota looked around the diner at the faces of people she'd served, and smiled at and listened to complain about everything from the weather to the government for 3 years. Good people. Ordinary people. People who deserved better than dying in a nuclear disaster because the military couldn't find a way to penetrate a facility designed to keep everyone out. She thought about the F-35B, sitting at Malmstrom Air Force Base, fueled and ready for a mission that would never get official authorization. She thought about the surface-to-air missiles surrounding the nuclear facility and the precise flight path that would be required to slip between their coverage zones. She thought about the 200 hostages inside the facility who would die if the rescue attempt failed, and the 50,000 people in the surrounding area who would die if no rescue attempt was made. Most of all, she thought about the oath she'd taken 8 years ago before the court-martial, before the disgrace, before she'd become Dakota the waitress instead of Captain Riley. "I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." The words echoed in her mind as she walked back toward the storage room, pulling out her phone to make a call. That would change everything. "Rusty," she said over her shoulder, "I need to borrow your truck. And I need you to trust me when I tell you that help is on the way." "Dakota, what the hell are you talking about?" She paused at the storage room door, looking back at the man who'd been kind to her when kindness was in short supply. "I'm talking about doing what I should have done a long time ago. I'm talking about remembering who I used to be." As she disappeared into the storage room to retrieve the encrypted tablet, Tommy Brennan's voice followed her. That girl's finally lost it. Stress got to her. If only he knew, Dakota thought as she began planning the most important mission of her life. That stress was exactly what she'd been trained for. The drive to Malmstrom Air Force Base took Dakota through 180 miles of Montana. Landscape that blurred past her borrowed pickup truck like memories she'd tried to forget. Rusty's old Ford rattled and wheezed as she pushed it to speeds the vehicle hadn't seen since the Clinton administration. But the encrypted radio chatter streaming through her earpiece kept her foot planted firmly on the accelerator. Ghost Rider. "This is Mountain Home Actual," came the voice of Colonel Patricia Vasquez, Dakota's former commanding officer and the woman who'd signed her discharge papers 3 years ago. "Current ETA to Malmstrom?" Dakota glanced at the GPS. Dakota nearly swerved off the highway. How the hell do they know about Ghost Rider? Unknown. But they've threatened to execute 5 hostages if any aircraft matching your flight profile approaches the facility. They know you're coming. The pickup truck crested a hill, and Dakota could see Malmstrom Air Force Base sprawling across the horizon like a metallic city. Runways stretched in multiple directions. Aircraft hangars dotted the landscape, and she could make out the distinctive silhouette of F-35 Lightning A's parked on the flight line. Seeing military aircraft again after 3 years of coffee pots and dinner plates sent an unexpected surge of adrenaline through her system. "Colonel, if they know I'm coming, this becomes a suicide mission. They'll be tracking my approach from the moment I take off." Negative, Ghost Rider. Intelligence analysis suggests they're bluffing. They need you to attempt the rescue so they can shoot you down publicly and prove that American military power is impotent against their cause. It's psychological warfare. Dakota downshifted as she approached the base's outer perimeter, her pilots' brain automatically cataloging wind direction, cloud cover, and atmospheric conditions. Perfect flying weather, which meant she'd have no environmental factors to hide behind during her approach to the nuclear facility. Permission to speak freely. "Colonel, granted. This mission is insane. Single-seat aircraft, no backup, penetrating the most advanced air defense system in the country, with terrorists who know I'm coming and 200 hostages who'll be executed if I screw up. Even if I somehow manage to disable the reactor cooling systems, there's no guarantee I'll prevent the meltdown." A long pause filled the radio silence. When Colonel Vasquez spoke again, her voice carried the weight of command decisions that kept generals awake at night. "Dakota, I'm going to tell you something that's not in any official briefing. The Millbrook facility isn't just a research installation. It's a prototype for next-generation nuclear defense systems. If that technology falls into terrorist hands, every nuclear facility in America becomes vulnerable to the same type of attack. We're not just talking about 50,000 casualties. We're talking about the potential for multiple Chernobyls across the entire country." The pickup truck's engine coughed as Dakota pulled up to Malmstrom's main gate, where 2 armed sentries stood beside a reinforced checkpoint that could stop a speeding semi-truck. Beyond the fence, she could see ground crews working frantically around a single F-35B Lightning II that sat apart from the other aircraft, fuel hoses and weapon loading equipment surrounding it like the tentacles of some mechanical octopus. "Colonel, are you asking me to do this because I'm the only pilot available, or because I'm expendable?" Another pause. "I'm asking you because you're the only pilot I know who's crazy enough to attempt it and skilled enough to have a chance of succeeding." Dakota showed her identification to the gate guards, who waved her through with the efficiency of soldiers who'd been briefed on her arrival. As she drove toward the flight line, she could see Major Rodriguez waiting beside the F-35B, his flight suit pristine and his expression skeptical. The aircraft itself was beautiful in the way that only military hardware could be: sleek, predatory, packed with technology that represented decades of aerospace engineering. She'd forgotten how much she missed being around machines, designed for precision and lethality instead of coffee and hash browns. She parked the pickup truck and walked toward Rodriguez, her waitress uniform and coffee-stained apron creating a surreal contrast with the high-tech military environment surrounding her. Several ground crew members stopped their work to stare at the woman who looked more qualified to serve them lunch than pilot their most advanced fighter jet. "Captain Riley," Rodriguez said, extending his hand with military formality. "It's been a while." "Actually, it's just Dakota now," she replied, accepting the handshake. The Air Force made it clear that Captain Riley no longer exists. Rodriguez gestured toward the F-35B. "Well, Dakota, meet your ride." Fully fueled, weapon systems loaded with precision-guided munitions, specifically designed for your mission. Parameters. The bird's been upgraded with the latest electronic countermeasures and stealth configurations. Dakota walked around the aircraft, her hands automatically checking inspection points she'd memorized years ago. Everything looked perfect, too perfect for a mission that was being thrown together in hours instead of months. "What's the catch, Rodriguez?" "This level of preparation doesn't happen overnight," he smiled grimly. "The catch is that this aircraft has been sitting here for 6 months, prepped and ready for a mission that was never officially approved. Someone's been planning for exactly this scenario." The implication hit Dakota like cold water. Someone knew this was going to happen. Someone knew it was possible. The question is whether that someone is on our side or theirs. Dakota looked at the F-35B's cockpit, designed for a pilot wearing a flight suit and helmet, not a diner uniform and an apron that still smelled like bacon grease. In 30 minutes, she'd be strapping herself into that ejection seat and betting her life on skills she hadn't used in 3 years. "Rodriguez, I need you to promise me something. If this goes wrong, if I don't make it back, make sure people know that Dakota the waitress died trying to save her town. Not Captain Riley trying to redeem herself." He studied her face for a long moment. "Copy that. But Dakota? Yeah? Don't you dare get yourself killed. We need pilots like you, even if the brass is too stupid to realize it." 28 minutes later, Dakota sat in the F-35B's cockpit, her civilian clothes replaced by a flight suit that fit like it had been tailored for her body. The aircraft systems hummed around her with the familiar symphony of hydraulics, electronics, and barely contained power that she'd dreamed about for 3 years. As the canopy lowered and sealed her into the cockpit, Dakota keyed her radio. One final time. "Mountain Home, this is Ghost Rider. Systems check complete. Mission profile uploaded. Target coordinates confirmed. I'm bringing everyone home." The F-35B's engine spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder, and Dakota Riley, waitress, pilot, and reluctant hero taxied toward a runway that would either lead her to redemption or turn her into the most spectacular failure in military aviation history. The F-35B. Lightning II had been airborne for exactly 43 minutes when Dakota's secure communication system exploded with incoming transmissions that made her blood freeze in the cockpit's climate-controlled environment. "Ghost Rider, this is Pentagon Command Authority," came a voice carrying the kind of bureaucratic authority that could end careers with a single word. "You are ordered to return to Malmstrom immediately and stand down from your current mission." Dakota checked her navigation display. She was still 60 miles from Millbrook, flying at 35,000 feet through airspace that had been cleared for her approach. The nuclear facility wasn't even visible on her horizon yet, but someone with serious political power had just attempted to abort the only rescue mission available to save 50,000 American civilians. "Pentagon Command, this is Ghost Rider. Please repeat your previous transmission. Did you just order me to abandon American hostages to a nuclear meltdown?" "Ghost Rider, you are flying a stolen military aircraft without proper authorization. Your mission has not been approved through appropriate channels and violates multiple federal statutes regarding unauthorized military operations on American soil. The voice belonged to Assistant Secretary of Defense Jonathan Blackwood, a political appointee who'd never spent a day in uniform but wielded more power over military operations than most generals. Dakota had encountered his type before. Bureaucrats who viewed military personnel as chess pieces to be moved around a board, according to political calculations rather than tactical necessity. "Mr. Blackwood," Dakota said, allowing her voice to carry the contempt she felt for Pentagon desk jockeys with respect. "People are going to die while you worry about paperwork." "Captain Riley, it's Dakota, sir." The Air Force made it very clear that Captain Riley no longer exists, remember? A new voice cut into the transmission, Colonel Vasquez, sounding strained. "Ghost Rider, be advised that Pentagon Command has issued a stand-down order for all aspects of your mission. You are directed to return to base immediately." Dakota's heads-up display showed Millbrook's approximate location ahead of her, still hidden by distance and terrain, but close enough that she could see the faint smudge of smoke on the horizon. Down there, 200 hostages were counting on someone with the skills and courage to attempt an impossible rescue. Behind them, 50,000 innocent civilians were going about their daily lives, unaware that their survival depended on a disgraced pilot who was apparently too politically inconvenient to save them. "Colonel, what's the real situation down there? Are the hostages still alive?" Static filled the radio for several seconds before Vasquez responded. "Ghost Rider, I'm ordered not to provide operational updates to unauthorized personnel." The bureaucratic doublespeak confirmed Dakota's worst fears. In the 43 minutes since she'd taken off, someone with political authority had decided that her mission was more dangerous to their careers than the nuclear meltdown was to American lives. Her radio crackled again, this time with Assistant Secretary Blackwood's voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. "Miss Riley, you are currently in violation of the following federal statutes: theft of military property, unauthorized operation of a military aircraft, violation of restricted airspace, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Land immediately or face prosecution under the full extent of military and civilian law." Dakota checked her fuel gauge, enough for the mission and return flight, but not enough for extended delays. Every minute she spent arguing with Pentagon bureaucrats was a minute closer to nuclear catastrophe. "Mr. Blackwood, let me make sure I understand the situation. You're ordering me to abandon 200 American hostages and allow a nuclear meltdown that will kill 50,000 people because I don't have the right signatures on the right forms? You're flying a stolen aircraft on an unauthorized mission that could trigger an international incident. The proper authorities are handling this situation through appropriate diplomatic channels." Dakota's tactical display showed her entering the outer perimeter of Millbrook's airspace. 20 miles ahead, the nuclear facility's air defense systems would begin tracking her approach. She had perhaps 10 minutes to decide whether to continue the mission or turn back and let bureaucratic procedure take precedence over American lives. "Colonel Vasquez, what diplomatic channels? What's the official plan for rescuing those hostages?" Silence stretched across the radio frequency like a death sentence. When Vasquez finally responded, her voice carried the weight of a career military officer watching political cowardice in action. "Ghost Rider, there's no official plan. The facility's air defenses make conventional rescue impossible, and the State Department believes that negotiation is the only viable option. How long do these negotiations have? Terrorists have moved their deadline up again. 4 hours until they trigger the meltdown." Dakota processed the tactical reality with the cold calculation that had once made her the Air Force's most effective pilot. 4 hours for diplomats to negotiate with terrorists who had already demonstrated their willingness to kill innocent people. 4 hours for bureaucrats to find a politically acceptable solution to a crisis that required immediate military action. 4 hours for 50,000 people to go about their lives before dying in the worst nuclear disaster in American history. "Mr. Blackwood," Dakota said into her radio, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. Do you have any other plan that will save those hostages and prevent the meltdown? That information is classified above your clearance level." The non-answer told Dakota everything she needed to know. The Pentagon had no plan except hoping that terrorists would somehow develop a conscience in the next 4 hours. Her radio exploded with new transmissions as multiple agencies attempted to assert authority over her mission. FBI counterterrorism coordinators demanded that she maintain distance from the facility to avoid interfering with their psychological warfare specialists. Homeland Security insisted that her approach would be considered an act of domestic terrorism. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission warned that any military action near the facility could trigger the exact meltdown she was trying to prevent. Through it all, Dakota maintained her heading toward Millbrook, watching her tactical display as the facility's air defense systems began painting her aircraft with targeting radars. The F-35B's stealth systems would protect her for now, but once she began her attack run, she'd be visible to every sensor system within 50 miles. "Ghost Rider, this is General Patricia Morrison, Joint Chiefs of Staff," came a new voice carrying the authority of America's highest military leadership. "You are ordered to abort your mission immediately. I repeat, abort your mission and return to base." Dakota recognized the name. Morrison was a political general who'd built her career by never taking risks that might damage her advancement prospects. The kind of officer who would sacrifice American lives to protect her own reputation. "General Morrison, I'm curious. When those 50,000 people die from radiation poisoning, will you be attending their funerals? Will you be explaining to their families why following proper channels was more important than saving their lives?" "Captain Riley, you are in direct violation of It's Dakota," she said, cutting off the general mid-sentence. "And General, with all due respect, those people down there don't care about my rank or my authorization. They care about going home to their families tonight." The radio fell silent as Dakota's aircraft crossed into Millbrook's defended airspace. Her tactical display immediately lit up with warning indicators as surface-to-air missile systems locked onto her approach. The F-35B's electronic countermeasures engaged automatically, creating a cocoon of electromagnetic interference designed to confuse enemy targeting systems. Below her, the nuclear facility appeared as a cluster of industrial buildings surrounded by defensive positions that looked like something from a science fiction movie. She could see vehicles moving between buildings, smoke still rising from the initial terrorist attack, and the distinctive signature of the facility's reactor building, where 200 hostages were being held by people willing to trigger a nuclear holocaust. "All stations, this is Ghost Rider," Dakota announced over her radio, addressing every bureaucrat, general, and politician who'd spent the past 20 minutes trying to abort her mission. "I'm beginning my attack run. When this is over, you can court-martial me, prosecute me, or give me a medal. I don't care anymore. But those people down there are going home to their families tonight, even if I have to steal every aircraft in the Air Force to make it happen." She switched off her radio, cutting herself off from the cascade of orders, threats, and legal warnings streaming from Washington. The F-35B dropped toward the nuclear facility like a controlled lightning bolt, carrying a disgraced waitress who decided that saving American lives was worth destroying what remained of her military career. In the facility below, 200 hostages waited for salvation that their own government had just ordered her not to provide. As the F-35B Lightning II descended through 15,000 feet toward the most dangerous mission of Dakota Riley's life, her mind drifted back to another crisis 8 years earlier, When she'd been 22 years old and convinced that the United States Air Force was her pathway to saving the world, the memory surfaced with crystalline clarity as she programmed her. Attack parameters: Kandahar. Province: Afghanistan, 2016. Second Lieutenant Dakota Riley, fresh out of flight school and eager to prove that the farm girl from Nebraska belonged in the cockpit of an F-16 Fighting Falcon. She'd grown up on a cattle ranch outside Broken Bow, population 3,559, where her father had taught her to fly crop dusters before she was old enough to drive legally. Flying's not about the machine, her father had told her during those early morning flights over cornfields that stretched to the horizon. It's about understanding that you're responsible for everything and everyone affected by where you put that aircraft. Every decision you make up there changes lives down here. The words had shaped her approach to military aviation, turning her into the kind of pilot who treated every mission like a sacred trust between her and the people she was sworn to protect. It was an attitude that had made her both exceptionally effective and occasionally insubordinate qualities that didn't always coexist peacefully in military culture. Afghanistan had been her first real test. A convoy of American soldiers had been ambushed in a narrow valley, pinned down by insurgent fighters who'd positioned themselves in caves that conventional artillery couldn't reach. The mission parameters had been clear: provide close air support, but avoid civilian casualties at all costs. Intelligence suggested that the caves contained not just enemy combatants but also local villagers being used as human shields. Dakota had circled overhead for 47 minutes, watching American soldiers die while she waited for authorization to engage targets that were technically within the rules of engagement, but politically sensitive. The insurgents had known exactly how to exploit American rules designed to minimize collateral damage, using them as shields while they systematically eliminated the convoy below. The breaking point had come when she'd watched through her targeting pod as a 19-year-old medic named Private Jackson crawled across open ground to reach a wounded squad leader. Jackson had been 3 feet from safety when an insurgent's rifle round had torn through his chest, dropping him in the dust of a country he'd probably never heard of before joining the Army. Dakota had made her choice in that moment, just as she was making it now above the nuclear facility. She'd identified the cave mouth where the sniper was positioned and put a 500-pound, precision-guided bomb exactly where it needed to go. The explosion had silenced the enemy position and allowed the remaining convoy members to reach safety. It had also killed 3 Afghan civilians, a grandmother, and 2 children who'd been forced into the cave by the insurgents. The official inquiry had praised her tactical effectiveness while condemning her failure to wait for explicit authorization. The message had been clear: American military personnel were expected to die rather than risk civilian casualties without proper approval from commanders, who were safely removed from the immediate crisis. Dakota had been reprimanded, transferred to a different squadron, and placed under the supervision of officers who viewed her as a risk to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. Her subsequent missions had been routine patrols and training exercises, the kind of assignments designed to keep ambitious pilots from making decisions that might embarrass their superiors. The pattern had continued for 6 years. Dakota had accumulated an exemplary flight record, expert marksman ratings, and commendations for technical proficiency, but she'd never again been trusted with missions that required independent judgment under pressure. The Air Force had wanted her skills but not her conscience. The final break had come 18 months ago during a classified mission that she still couldn't discuss in detail. What she could remember was standing in a briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base, listening to a colonel explain why American hostages in a North African country would have to remain captive because rescuing them might damage diplomatic relationships with a government that was actively facilitating their capture. Sometimes, Lieutenant Colonel Riley, the colonel had said, the greater good requires accepting smaller tragedies. Dakota had looked around the briefing room at officers who nodded approvingly at this logic, seeing in their faces the same bureaucratic calculation that had just ordered her to abandon the Millbrook hostages. She'd realized in that moment that she was serving in a military establishment that had forgotten the difference between political expediency and moral courage. Her response had been immediate and career-ending. "Sir, with respect, the greater good that allows American citizens to die for diplomatic convenience isn't good at all. It's cowardice disguised as strategy." The court-martial had been swift and thorough. Insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to follow lawful orders, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. Her military career had ended with a dishonorable discharge and a psychological evaluation that had concluded she was unsuited for military service due to an inability to subordinate personal moral judgment to institutional authority. The evaluation had been correct, Dakota reflected as she adjusted her approach vector toward the nuclear facility. She was unsuited for a military that valued obedience over effectiveness, politics over principles, but she was perfectly suited for situations like this one, where institutional authority had failed and someone needed to take personal responsibility for American lives. The transition from decorated Air Force officer to small-town waitress had been brutal. Military contractors wouldn't hire someone with a dishonorable discharge. Civilian aviation companies were suspicious of pilots who'd been drummed out of the Air Force for disciplinary reasons. Corporate America didn't know what to do with someone whose primary skills involved precision violence and life-or-death decision-making. She'd ended up in Millbrook by accident, driving through Montana on her way to a job interview in Seattle that she'd never reached. Rusty's Diner had been advertising for help, and Dakota had been down to her last $100 and tired of sleeping in her car. What was supposed to be a temporary stop to earn gas money had become 3 years of serving coffee and pretending that Captain Dakota Riley had never existed. The work had been simultaneously humbling and healing. After years of making decisions that affected international relations and military operations, there was something peaceful about problems that could be solved with extra bacon or a fresh pot of coffee. The people of Millbrook had accepted her without questions, treating her with the kind of straightforward kindness that she'd forgotten existed in a world of security, clearances and classified briefings. Mrs. Henderson had shared pictures of her grandchildren. Billy Martinez had asked for advice about college applications. Tommy Brennan had flirted with the awkward sincerity of someone who saw her as a person, rather than a security risk or a political liability. For 3 years, Dakota had convinced herself that she was content with invisibility, that serving coffee was a fair trade for avoiding the moral compromises required by military service, that being nobody special was preferable to being someone whose conscience made her unsuited for institutional authority. Carmen Martinez's frightened face had shattered that illusion completely. The 8-year-old girl who called her Miss Dakota and always asked for extra whipped cream on her hot chocolate had reminded Dakota why she'd become a pilot in the first place. Not for the excitement or the technology or the prestige, but for the simple moral clarity of protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. As her F-35B passed through 8,000 feet, Dakota could see the nuclear facility's defensive positions with enough detail to plan her attack run. Surface-to-air missile batteries tracked her approach, their targeting radars painting her aircraft with electronic signatures that would have terrified most pilots. But Dakota had spent her career flying into situations where people were shooting at her, and the familiar sensation of controlled fear was almost comforting after 3 years of emotional numbness. The radio had been silent since she'd switched off communications with Pentagon Command, but she knew that somewhere above her, satellite surveillance was recording every aspect of her approach. Her mission would be analyzed, critiqued, and probably used as evidence in the court-martial that would inevitably follow. She didn't care anymore. The woman who'd worried about military careers and official approval had died in that briefing. Room 18 months ago. What remained was Dakota Riley, former cattle rancher's daughter, current diner waitress, and the only pilot within 500 miles who was willing to risk everything to save people. She'd grown to love the F-35B's weapons. Systems completed their final targeting sequence as the facility's air defenses locked onto her aircraft. Below her, 200 hostages waited for salvation. 50,000 civilians continued their daily lives unaware of the nuclear sword hanging over their heads. And a small-town diner sat empty because its waitress had remembered who she used to be. The surface-to-air missile launch detected by Dakota's threat warning system came at exactly 4,000 feet altitude, screaming toward her F-35B at Mach 3 with the kind of precision that suggested military-grade targeting systems rather than improvised terrorist weapons. As she rolled the aircraft into a violent evasive maneuver, pulling 7.2 Gs that compressed her body into the ejection seat like a giant invisible hand, Dakota realized that everything the Pentagon had told her about this mission was a lie. The missile that barely missed her starboard wing wasn't some black market weapon cobbled together by religious fanatics. It was a state-of-the-art Russian-made S-400 surface-to-air system that cost more money than most countries spent on their entire military budgets. Someone with serious resources and sophisticated connections had turned the Millbrook Nuclear Research Facility into a fortress designed specifically to keep out American military aircraft. "Warning, warning, missile lock detected," announced her F-35B's artificial intelligence system in the maddeningly calm voice that military contractors programmed into equipment designed to function during life-or-death crises. Multiple tracking. Radars active. Recommend immediate evasive action. Dakota was already pulling her aircraft through a series of defensive maneuvers that would have killed most pilots, using the F-35B's thrust vectoring capabilities to change direction in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics. But even as she evaded the immediate threats, her tactical mind was processing information that painted a terrifying picture of what was really happening at Millbrook. The facility's defensive positions weren't random placements designed by desperate terrorists. They were professionally engineered, overlapping fields of fire that covered every possible approach vector with military precision. Whoever had planned this operation understood American tactical doctrine well enough to counter it systematically. More disturbing was the radio chatter her aircraft's electronic surveillance system was intercepting from the facility below. The communications weren't in Arabic or Farsi or any of the languages associated with Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. They were in English, spoken with American accents, using military terminology and coordination protocols that suggested professional training rather than ideological fanaticism. "Raptor Base, this is Overwatch," came one transmission that made Dakota's blood freeze. "Packages inbound, single F-35B Lightning II, probably the pilot we were briefed about. Weapons free, repeat, weapons free. Package." Military slang for an incoming target, the pilot we were briefed about. They hadn't just expected her to attempt this rescue, they'd been specifically prepared for Dakota Riley. Her threat warning system screamed again as another missile launch painted her aircraft. This time she didn't have altitude to trade for evasive maneuvering. At 2,500 feet above the facility, she was committed to her attack run, whether the people below were terrorists or something far more dangerous. The precision-guided munitions she'd selected for her primary target, the facility's main power grid, required a stable flight path for the final 30 seconds before release. As surface-to-air missiles converged on her position from 3 different directions, Dakota faced the same impossible choice that had defined her entire military career: follow safe tactical procedures or risk everything to complete the mission. She chose to risk everything. The F-35B dropped into a near-vertical dive that brought her below the minimum engagement envelope of the facility's largest missiles while simultaneously putting her on a collision course with the ground at 400 miles per hour. For 15 seconds that felt like 15 hours, Dakota flew through a corridor of intersecting machine gun fire and smaller missile attacks, trusting her aircraft's armor and her own reflexes to carry her through what military tacticians called a high-threat environment. Her bomb bay doors opened at 800 feet above ground level. The precision-guided munition dropped free of her aircraft with the inevitability of gravity, its internal guidance system already locked onto the facility's electrical substation. Dakota pulled out of her dive with barely 200 feet of altitude to spare, her aircraft's engines screaming as she climbed away from the target area. The explosion behind her lit up the Montana afternoon like a miniature sunrise. The facility's main power grid disappeared in a ball of flame and debris that sent electrical transformers flying hundreds of yards in every direction. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the complex as backup generators attempted to compensate for the sudden loss of primary power. But instead of the confusion and panic she'd expected from a terrorist organization suddenly plunged into darkness, Dakota's surveillance equipment detected coordinated movement throughout the facility. Backup systems engaged with military efficiency. Personnel moved to predetermined positions. Radio communications continued without interruption. Overwatch, this is Raptor Base, came another transmission that confirmed Dakota's worst fears. Primary power grid is down, but all defensive systems remain operational on backup power. Target is climbing, bearing 270, recommend immediate intercept. These weren't terrorists improvising responses to an unexpected attack. They were military professionals executing a carefully planned defense against the exact type of rescue mission she was attempting. Her radio crackled to life with an unexpected transmission on a frequency that should have been impossible for anyone at the facility to access her secure military communications channel. Ghost Rider, this is Sentinel Actual, came a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding elite military units. You're flying into a trap, Captain. Recommend immediate withdrawal to safe distance. Dakota's hands tightened on her aircraft's controls. Captain, whoever was transmitting knew her former rank despite her dishonorable discharge. They also knew her call sign and had access to communications equipment that required the highest level of security clearances. Sentinel Actual, identify yourself. How did you obtain this frequency? A pause filled with static then. Captain Riley, I'm Colonel James Harrison, Defense Intelligence Agency. What you're seeing below isn't a terrorist attack on a nuclear facility. It's a false flag operation designed to justify military intervention in domestic affairs. The words hit Dakota like a physical blow. False flag. A military operation conducted by one's own side, but designed to appear as if it were carried out by enemies. If Colonel Harrison was telling the truth, then the terrorists holding 200 American hostages weren't foreign enemies at all. They were American operatives creating a crisis that would expand military authority over civilian populations. Colonel, if this is a false flag, who's running it? Elements within our own defense establishment who believe that traditional constitutional limitations on military power are inadequate for modern threats. They've created an artificial crisis to demonstrate that only expanded military authority can protect American civilians from catastrophic attacks. Dakota's tactical display showed her climbing through 6,000 feet, temporarily safe from the facility's defensive systems but rapidly approaching the moment when she'd have to decide whether to continue her mission or accept that everything she'd been told was a deception. What about the hostages? Are they real? The hostages are real, Captain. 200 civilian employees of the Millbrook facility who were told they were participating in a security exercise. They don't know they're being used as props in a staged crisis. The full scope of the betrayal settled over Dakota like a physical weight. The Pentagon officials who'd ordered her to abort the mission hadn't been motivated by bureaucratic cowardice. They'd been trying to prevent her from discovering that the entire crisis was manufactured by elements within their own government. Colonel Harrison, what's my best course of action? Return to base, Captain. Let this play out through official channels. Don't risk your life for a situation that's designed to be unsolvable. Dakota looked down at the Millbrook facility, where 200 innocent people were being held hostage by their own government in service of a political agenda she didn't understand. She thought about Carmen Martinez, 8 years old and terrified that bad men were going to hurt her family. She thought about Mrs. Henderson and Billy Martinez and Tommy Brennan and all the other people in Millbrook who were living in the shadow of a nuclear disaster that existed only to justify expanding military control over American society. Colonel, with respect, those people down there don't care whether their hostage situation is real or manufactured. They just want to go home to their families. Captain Riley, you cannot solve this situation with military force. The people holding those hostages are American military personnel following orders they believe are legitimate. Dakota adjusted her aircrafts heading back toward the facility, her decision made with the same moral clarity that had ended her military career and brought her to this moment. Colonel, I've spent 3 years learning that sometimes the most important battles are the ones your own side doesn't want you to fight. The radio fell silent as Dakota began her second attack run, diving toward a facility defended by her own countrymen in service of a conspiracy. She was only beginning to understand the electromagnetic pulse that disabled Dakota's F-35B Lightning II came not from the facility's defensive systems, but from a modified Boeing E-4B Nightwatch aircraft orbiting at 40,000 feet, the kind of specialized electronic warfare platform that only existed within the most classified compartments of American military operations. As her flight controls went dead and her engines flamed out simultaneously, Dakota realized that the conspiracy she'd stumbled into had resources that extended far beyond a single nuclear facility in Montana. Warning: multiple system failures detected, announced her aircraft's artificial intelligence system, its calm voice a surreal counterpoint to the screaming alarm klaxons filling her cockpit. Flight controls offline, navigation offline, communications offline, recommend immediate ejection. Dakota's hands flew across her instrument panel, attempting to restart systems that had been systematically fried by electromagnetic radiation. Designed specifically to neutralize the F-35B's electronic architecture. Whoever had planned this trap understood her aircraft's vulnerabilities better than most of the engineers who designed it. The F-35B was falling toward the Montana landscape at a rate that would impact the ground in approximately 90 seconds. Without power, without flight controls, and without communications, Dakota faced the choice that every military pilot trained for but hoped never to encounter: eject and survive, or ride the aircraft down and almost certainly die in the attempt. To maintain some vestige of mission capability, through her cockpit windows, she could see the Millbrook facility growing larger as her unpowered aircraft descended in what was essentially a controlled crash. 200 hostages were somewhere in those buildings below. Innocent civilians whose only crime had been working for a government that was willing to sacrifice them for political theater. At 3,000 feet altitude, Dakota made her choice, instead of reaching for the ejection handle that would blast her clear of the dying aircraft. She began the process of manual flight control that she'd practiced countless times in simulator training but never attempted in an actual emergency. Using rudder pedals and control stick inputs that bypassed the aircraft's electronic systems, she began converting her uncontrolled descent into something resembling a glide path. The technique was called dead stick, flying piloting an aircraft with no engine power, using only aerodynamic principles and whatever altitude could be traded for forward momentum. Military pilots practiced it extensively, but always with the understanding that successful dead-stick landings required optimal conditions, perfect timing, and extraordinary luck. Dakota had none of those advantages. Her aircraft was designed for supersonic flight and vertical landing, not unpowered gliding. The terrain below offered no suitable landing sites, only rocky hills, scattered buildings, and the kind of obstacles that turned emergency landings into fireballs. Most critically, she was attempting the maneuver while under active fire from people who wanted her dead or captured at 2,000 feet. Her radio crackled back to life with a transmission that made her understand the full scope of what she was facing. "Ghost Rider, this is General Patricia Morrison, Joint Chiefs of Staff," came the voice of the officer who'd ordered her to abort the mission. "Your aircraft has been disabled by electronic countermeasures deployed for your own protection. Eject immediately and surrender to personnel on the ground. You will be treated according to military justice protocols." Electronic countermeasures deployed for your own protection. The euphemism was so transparently false that Dakota almost laughed despite her desperate situation. They'd shot down her aircraft to prevent her from discovering that American military personnel were holding American civilians hostage in a manufactured crisis designed to expand government power. "General Morrison," Dakota replied, fighting to keep her aircraft's nose up as she descended through 1,500 feet. "With respect, ma'am, when this is over, I hope someone explains to those hostages how destroying my rescue attempt was for my own protection. Captain Riley, you are interfering with a classified national security operation. Land immediately and submit to military custody." The title she'd used, Captain Riley, instead of the civilian Miss Riley, preferred by Pentagon bureaucrats, revealed that Dakota's military status had been quietly restored for this mission. Someone had decided that prosecuting a civilian for stealing military aircraft was more complicated than court-martialing an officer for insubordination, which meant they were planning to destroy her career for a second time. At 1,000 feet altitude, Dakota could see personnel moving around the facility's perimeter, not the improvised positions of desperate terrorists, but the professional deployment of military units establishing containment around a controlled crisis. Vehicles were positioned with the geometric precision of people following established protocols. Personnel moved with the coordinated efficiency of troops executing a plan they'd rehearsed extensively. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. How many people were involved in creating and maintaining this elaborate fiction? How many military personnel had been told they were participating in essential national security operations when they were actually helping to stage a fake terrorist attack? Dakota's aircraft passed through 500 feet altitude as she aimed for what appeared to be the least dangerous crash site available, a section of rough terrain northeast of the facility that was relatively free of obstacles. She had perhaps 20 seconds before impact, 20 seconds to complete whatever remained of her mission before dying in the wreckage of a stolen fighter jet. Her aircraft's weapon systems were offline, but her pilot survival kit contained equipment that might serve one final purpose. Among the standard emergency supplies was a military-grade camera designed to document crash sites and enemy positions, equipment that could provide evidence of what was really happening at the Millbrook facility. As her F-35B descended through its final approach, Dakota activated the camera and began recording everything she could see through her cockpit windows. Military vehicles with American markings, personnel in U.S. Army uniforms, communication equipment that belonged to domestic intelligence agencies rather than terrorist organizations, evidence that the nuclear crisis, threatening 50,000 American civilians, was being orchestrated by their own government. The impact came at 150 miles per hour across rocky ground that had never been designed to accommodate the landing of a 35,000-pound fighter aircraft. Dakota's harness and ejection seat absorbed most of the initial shock, but the secondary impacts as her aircraft bounced, slid, and tumbled across the landscape turned her vision black and filled her ears with the screaming sounds of metal being torn apart by physics. When the wreckage finally came to rest, Dakota found herself hanging upside down in a cockpit filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning electronics. Her left arm was definitely broken. Her ribs felt like someone had beaten her with a baseball bat. Blood from a scalp wound was dripping upward into her hair due to her inverted position. But she was alive, conscious, and still holding the camera that contained evidence of the most significant domestic conspiracy in American history. Her shattered cockpit windows, Dakota could see military vehicles converging on her crash site. Personnel in full battle gear were establishing a perimeter around her wreckage with the kind of efficiency that suggested they'd been waiting for exactly this outcome. They hadn't wanted to kill her, they'd wanted to capture her and the evidence she'd collected. Dakota managed to extract herself from her harness and crawl through the aircraft's emergency exit, her broken arm sending waves of agony through her nervous system with every movement. The camera went into her survival vest's waterproof pocket, protected by layers of Kevlar and ceramic armor plating that might keep it intact, even if she didn't survive the next few minutes. As military boots crunched across the rocky ground toward her position, Dakota looked back at the Millbrook facility in the distance. Somewhere in those buildings, 200 innocent civilians were being held hostage by people wearing American uniforms in service of a conspiracy that had just cost her everything she had left to lose. Her military career was over for the second time. Her civilian life in Millbrook was finished, even if she survived. She could never return to serving coffee and pretending to be nobody special. The people who'd orchestrated this conspiracy had resources that extended to the highest levels of government, which meant that exposing them would require more courage than she'd already demonstrated. But as the first soldier reached her position and aimed his rifle at her chest, Dakota realized that losing everything had given her a peculiar kind of freedom. She had no career to protect, no reputation to preserve, no future to safeguard. She had only the truth and the camera in her vest pocket, and the moral clarity that came from finally understanding what she was really fighting against. "Hands where I can see them," ordered the soldier, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Dakota raised her hands, her broken left arm screaming in protest, and looked directly into the young man's eyes. He was maybe 25 years old, probably convinced that he was serving his country by participating in what he'd been told was a classified national security operation. "Son," she said quietly, "do you have any idea what you're really doing here?" The question hung in the Montana air like an accusation as more soldiers surrounded the wreckage of her aircraft, and Dakota Riley, former Air Force captain, disgraced waitress, and reluctant witness to government conspiracy, prepared for whatever came next. The military detention facility where Dakota spent the next 72 hours existed in the administrative twilight zone reserved for operations that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Located somewhere in the Colorado mountains, she'd counted approximately 4 hours of helicopter flight time from her crash site. The compound combined the sterile efficiency of a modern prison with the isolation necessary for containing witnesses to classified programs. Her cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, furnished with a steel frame bed, a stainless steel toilet, and fluorescent lighting that never turned off. The walls were painted the particular shade of institutional green that psychologists had determined was least likely to promote emotional stability or creative thinking. Everything about the environment was designed to break down resistance and encourage cooperation with interrogators. Dakota had spent enough time in military survival training to recognize the psychological warfare techniques being employed against her. Sleep deprivation through constant lighting and irregular meal schedules. Social isolation to increase dependence on human contact with interrogators. Physical discomfort through inadequate medical treatment for her injuries, her broken arm. had been set and splinted, but no pain medication had been provided. The interrogation sessions followed a predictable pattern. Each morning at 0600 hours, 2 officers would escort her to a windowless room, where a rotating cast of intelligence specialists attempted to extract information about her mission, her contacts, and most importantly, any evidence she might have collected during her unauthorized flight. "Miss Riley," said Commander Sarah Blackwood, a Navy intelligence officer who'd been leading the questioning for the past 2 days, "let's discuss what you recorded during your approach to the Millbrook facility." Dakota maintained the same response she'd given to every previous interrogation. "I want to speak with a lawyer, and I want to contact a member of the press." "Miss Riley, you're being held under National Defense Authorization Act provisions that allow indefinite detention of individuals who pose threats to national security. You have no right to legal counsel or media contact until your case has been reviewed by appropriate authorities." The NDAA provisions were a legal gray area that had been designed for foreign terrorists, not American citizens. But Dakota understood that she'd stumbled into a conspiracy involving people with sufficient authority to reinterpret federal law whenever convenient. "Commander Blackwood, exactly what national security threat do I pose?" "I tried to rescue American hostages from what I was told was a terrorist attack." Blackwood consulted her tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be detailed psychological profiles and background assessments. "Miss Riley, you stole a military aircraft worth $100 million, conducted an unauthorized attack on a federal facility, and interfered with a classified operation involving multiple government agencies. Your actions demonstrated a pattern of insubordination and disregard for lawful authority that makes you unsuitable for release into civilian society." The phrase "unsuitable for release into civilian society" carried implications that made Dakota's blood freeze. They weren't planning to prosecute her through normal legal channels. They were planning to make her disappear permanently. On the evening of her 3rd day in detention, Dakota's routine was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor who changed everything she thought she understood about her situation. "Miss Riley, you have someone here to see you," announced the guard, a young Army specialist who'd been consistently professional, despite the obviously irregular nature of her detention. The visitor was a woman in her 50s, dressed in an expensive business suit that suggested private sector employment rather than government service. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to exercising authority in high-stakes situations, but her eyes held the kind of wariness that came from operating in morally ambiguous environments. "Miss Riley, my name is Victoria Sterling, and I represent certain interests that are concerned about your current situation." Dakota studied the woman carefully, noting details that suggested military background disguised by civilian clothing. "What kind of interests, Miss Sterling?" "The kind that believe American military personnel shouldn't be imprisoned without due process for attempting to save American lives." Sterling sat across from Dakota at the metal table that dominated the small meeting room. "I'm here to offer you an alternative to indefinite detention." "What kind of alternative?" Sterling opened a leather briefcase and extracted a folder containing documents that appeared to be legal contracts rather than government forms. "My organization provides specialized services to clients who require capabilities that aren't available through official channels. We're prepared to offer you employment at a salary of $250,000 annually, plus comprehensive medical benefits and legal protection from prosecution for your recent activities." Dakota recognized the offer for what it was: private military contracting, the shadow world where former government operatives used their skills for corporate clients who needed results without oversight or accountability. She'd heard rumors about such organizations during her military service, companies that recruited personnel who'd been burned by government bureaucracy and were willing to work outside official channels. "Miss Sterling, exactly what kind of services does your organization provide?" "We solve problems that governments can't address through official means." Sometimes that involves extracting personnel from hostile environments. Sometimes it involves gathering intelligence that traditional agencies can't obtain. Sometimes it involves providing security for clients who require absolute discretion. The euphemisms were transparent enough. Sterling's organization was offering her the chance to become a professional mercenary, using her skills in service of whoever could afford to pay for results without asking uncomfortable questions about methods. What's the catch? Sterling smiled, with the practiced warmth of someone who'd made similar offers to other desperate individuals. The catch is that you would be required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevent you from discussing your military service, your recent detention, or anything you might have learned about operations at the Millbrook facility. In exchange, all charges against you would be dropped, and you would be free to rebuild your life with financial security. Dakota understood the real terms of the offer. Sterling's organization would arrange her release from detention in exchange for her silence about the government conspiracy she'd discovered. They were offering her money, freedom, and the chance to use her skills again. All she had to do was pretend that she'd never witnessed American military personnel staging a fake terrorist attack. Miss Sterling, what happens if I refuse your offer? Miss Riley, you're currently facing charges that could result in life imprisonment or execution for treason. The evidence against you is overwhelming theft of military property, unauthorized attacks on federal facilities, interference with classified operations. Without legal representation or media attention, your case will be processed through military tribunal systems that prioritize national security over individual rights. The threat was delivered with the same professional courtesy that Sterling had used to describe her organization's services. Dakota would either accept employment as a mercenary, or she would spend the rest of her life in detention facilities like this one. I need time to consider your offer, Dakota said. Of course. But Miss Riley, I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. My clients have other candidates they're considering, and they need a decision within 24 hours. After Sterling left, Dakota was returned to her cell where she spent the night staring at the fluorescent lights and weighing her options. She could accept Sterling's offer and escape detention, but only by abandoning any hope of exposing the conspiracy. At Millbrook, the 200 hostages who were being used as props in a government false flag operation would remain captives, and the precedent would be set for future manufactured crises. Alternatively, she could refuse the offer and face whatever consequences the government had planned for troublesome witnesses. Given the resources that had been deployed to capture her, those consequences were likely to be permanent and final. As dawn light began filtering through the small window in her cell, Dakota thought about Carmen Martinez asking if the bad men were going to hurt her family. She thought about Mrs. Henderson and Billy Martinez and Tommy Brennan and all the other people in Millbrook who deserved better than living in the shadow of a government conspiracy. Most importantly, she thought about the camera in her survival vest, which contained evidence that could expose the truth about what was really happening at the nuclear facility. Evidence that was probably in government hands by now, but which might still exist somewhere in the bureaucratic maze of classified programs and compartmentalized operations. When Sterling returned the next morning, Dakota was ready with her answer. Miss Sterling, I appreciate your offer, but I'm going to have to decline. Sterling's professional demeanor slipped slightly, revealing genuine surprise. Miss Riley, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. This may be your only chance to avoid spending the rest of your life in federal prison. Dakota met the woman's eyes with the same steady gaze she'd used when facing surface-to-air missiles over the Millbrook facility. Miss Sterling, I understand my situation perfectly. What I don't understand is how many other American citizens are going to be held hostage by their own government, while people like you offer mercenary work as the only alternative to detention without trial. As Sterling packed her briefcase and prepared to leave, Dakota realized that she'd just chosen principle over survival for the third time in her life. First in Afghanistan, then during her court-martial, and now in a detention facility where refusing lucrative employment might mean never seeing freedom again. But as the cell door locked behind Sterling's departure, Dakota felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years of serving coffee and pretending to be nobody special. The satisfaction of knowing that she'd made the right choice, regardless of the consequences. The transfer from the Colorado detention facility came without warning at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning, when Dakota was awakened by guards who moved with the urgent efficiency of people executing orders they didn't fully understand. Instead of the standard military transport she'd expected, she found herself aboard a civilian helicopter operated by contractors whose uniforms bore no identifying marks or government insignia. "Where are we going?" she asked the lead contractor, a scarred man in his 40s whose bearing suggested special operations background. "Somewhere you can be more useful than rotting in a federal prison," he replied, handing her a sealed envelope. "Orders from people who outrank everyone who's been holding you." The envelope contained documents that revealed the existence of a government program she'd never heard of during her military service, Project Crosswind, a joint CIA-Pentagon initiative designed to investigate and counter domestic threats to national security that couldn't be addressed through official channels. According to the briefing materials, Crosswind operated with presidential authority but outside normal congressional oversight, handling situations where traditional government agencies were compromised or inadequate. Dakota's new assignment was outlined in language that was simultaneously vague and ominous. Intelligence analyst and field operative specializing in aeronautical threats to homeland security, with particular emphasis on operations involving rogue military personnel and advanced aircraft systems. The helicopter landed at a facility that didn't appear on any map she'd ever seen, complex of modern buildings hidden in the Nevada desert, surrounded by defensive positions that made Malmstrom Air Force Base look like a civilian airport. Everything about the installation suggested resources that exceeded normal government budgets and authority that transcended normal government limitations. Her new handler was a woman who introduced herself only as Director Walsh, a tall brunette in her early 50s whose crisp business attire couldn't disguise the predatory awareness of someone who'd spent decades making life and death decisions in classified environments. "Miss Riley, welcome to Crosswind Operations Center," Walsh said as they walked through corridors lined with sophisticated communications equipment and tactical displays, showing global military deployments. "I trust your recent experiences have given you a clearer understanding of the threats facing American security interests." Dakota recognized the subtle manipulation in Walsh's phrasing. Her illegal detention was being reframed as educational preparation for her new assignment. "Director Walsh, exactly what kind of threats are we talking about?" "The kind that emerge when government agencies become more interested in protecting their own authority than protecting American citizens." Walsh stopped at a secure briefing room where multiple monitors displayed intelligence reports from around the world. "Over the past 18 months, we've identified at least 12 incidents where military or intelligence personnel have conducted unauthorized operations against domestic targets." The monitors showed evidence that painted a disturbing picture of government dysfunction, military exercises that had been used to intimidate civilian populations, intelligence operations that had targeted American journalists, defense contractors who had sold classified weapons to private security firms with questionable loyalties. "Director Walsh, are you telling me that what happened at Millbrook wasn't an isolated incident?" "Miss Riley, what happened at Millbrook was a relatively sophisticated example of a growing problem. Rogue elements within our own government are creating artificial crises to justify expanded authority and increased budgets. Your interference with their operation provided us with evidence that these programs exist and are actively threatening civilian populations." Dakota studied the intelligence displays, recognizing classified aircraft and weapon systems that should have been under strict government control but were apparently being operated by private organizations with unclear objectives. What's my role in this? Walsh activated a holographic display that showed detailed schematics of advanced military aircraft, including several models that Dakota had never seen before. Your expertise in aviation systems and your demonstrated willingness to act independently make you uniquely qualified for field operations that require both technical knowledge and moral flexibility. Moral flexibility. The euphemism sent warning signals through Dakota's mind, reminding her of the private military contractor's offer she'd rejected in the detention facility. Director Walsh, when you say moral flexibility, what exactly do you mean? I mean the ability to operate in situations where traditional rules of engagement don't apply, where the distinction between domestic and foreign threats has become meaningless, and where protecting American lives requires actions that can't be officially sanctioned or publicly acknowledged. The briefing continued for 6 hours, during which Dakota was introduced to a world that existed in the shadows between official government operations and private sector security. Project Crosswind employed former military personnel who'd been burned by bureaucratic betrayal, intelligence operatives who discovered that their own agencies were compromised, and technical specialists who understood that advanced technology was being weaponized against the American people by the very institutions created to protect them. Her first assignment involved investigating reports of unmarked military aircraft, conducting surveillance operations over major American cities. Intelligence suggested that the flights were being conducted by defense contractors who were collecting data on civilian populations for purposes that remained classified even within the Pentagon. The aircraft are using modified stealth technology that makes them invisible to standard radar systems, explained Dr. Jennifer Chun, Crosswind's technical intelligence director. But they're not invisible to pilots who understand the visual signatures of advanced aircraft operating in civilian airspace. Dakota recognized the implication. Her years of experience with military aviation made her one of the few people who could identify and intercept aircraft that were designed to be undetectable. Dr. Chen, if these surveillance flights are being conducted by American defense contractors, what authority do we have to interfere with their operations? Miss Riley, these operations are being conducted without congressional authorization or public oversight. The contractors involved are selling intelligence about American citizens to foreign governments while claiming to provide homeland security services. They're engaged in espionage against their own country. The moral complexity of her situation was becoming clear. Dakota was being asked to use her skills against American military personnel and defense contractors who were technically operating under government authority, even if that authority was being abused for personal profit or political control. Her living quarters at the Crosswind facility reflected the organization's unique status: comfortable but isolated, equipped with advanced communications and entertainment systems but monitored by security personnel who were polite but omnipresent. She was neither prisoner nor employee, but something between the two, a valuable asset being carefully managed by people who understood her capabilities and motivations. The other operatives she met during her first week painted a picture of individuals who'd been recruited under similar circumstances. Former CIA officers who discovered their own agencies were conducting illegal domestic surveillance. Military personnel who'd been court-martialed for refusing to participate in operations that violated constitutional law. Intelligence analysts who'd been silenced for reporting evidence of government corruption. We're all here because we couldn't stomach what our own government was asking us to do, explained Captain Michael Torres, a former Army Special Forces officer who'd been recruited after exposing a Pentagon program that was selling weapons to cartel organizations in Mexico. The question is whether working for Crosswind makes us part of the solution or just a different kind of problem. Dakota's first field mission launched 72 hours after her arrival, when satellite surveillance detected one of the unmarked aircraft conducting unauthorized reconnaissance over Denver, Colorado. Her assignment was to intercept the aircraft using a modified F-16 Fighting Falcon and force it to land at a secure airfield where crosswind personnel could interrogate the crew and examine their surveillance equipment. As she strapped herself into the cockpit of an aircraft that bore no military markings or identification numbers, Dakota realized that she'd entered a world where the line between legal and illegal, authorized and unauthorized, had been deliberately erased. She was flying military aircraft that officially didn't exist, conducting operations that weren't officially authorized, against targets who might or might not be enemies of the American people. But as her F-16 climbed toward the intercept coordinates, Dakota felt something she hadn't experienced since her days as an Dakota Air Force pilot: the satisfaction of using her skills in service of people who trusted her judgment and respected her willingness to take risks for the greater good, whether that greater good was actually being served by Project Crosswind remained to be determined. But after months of detention and moral uncertainty, Dakota was finally flying again, finally working with people who valued results over bureaucratic compliance, finally operating in an environment where her conscience was considered an asset rather than a liability. The unmarked surveillance aircraft appeared on her radar at exactly the coordinates intelligence had predicted, flying a pattern that confirmed it was collecting detailed information about civilian infrastructure and population centers. As Dakota maneuvered her F-16 into an intercept position, she activated her radio to deliver the challenge that would either result in peaceful compliance or aerial combat over American airspace. Unknown aircraft operating over Denver metropolitan area. This is Crosswind Interceptor. You are conducting unauthorized surveillance in violation of federal airspace regulations. Alter course to bearing 090 and prepare for escort to secure landing facility. The response came immediately, delivered in a voice that carried the confidence of someone who believed they were protected by government authority. Crosswind Interceptor. This is Raven 6 conducting authorized homeland security operations under Defense Department charter. Break off your intercept and return to base. Dakota smiled grimly as she maintained her intercept course. After years of being told that following orders was more important than protecting American lives, she was finally working for people who understood that some authority was worth challenging. Raven 6, your operations are not authorized by any legitimate government agency. You have 30 seconds to comply with intercept instructions or face defensive measures. The aerial chess game that followed would determine whether Dakota had finally found her place in the complex world of modern national security, or whether she'd simply traded one form of moral compromise for another: the encrypted hard drive that Dakota discovered in the wreckage of the surveillance aircraft she'd forced down over Denver contained terabytes of data that shattered everything she thought she understood about Project Crosswind, the Millbrook incident, and her own role in a conspiracy that extended far beyond rogue government operations. She'd been analyzing the intercepted intelligence for 3 weeks in Crosswind's secure data center when she stumbled across a folder labeled Ghost Rider Operations Archive, a designation that made her blood freeze, since Ghost Rider was her personal call sign that should have been known only to her former Air Force commanders and the intelligence personnel who'd briefed her for the Millbrook mission. The files contained detailed surveillance reports on her activities dating back 6 years, beginning with her service in Afghanistan and continuing through her court-martial, her civilian life in Millbrook, and her recruitment by Project Crosswind. Every aspect of her existence had been monitored, documented, and analyzed by people who'd been planning to use her long before the nuclear facility crisis had provided the perfect opportunity. Subject demonstrates consistent pattern of prioritizing civilian protection over institutional authority. Read one psychological assessment dated 18 months before the Millbrook incident. Recommended for operational deployment in scenarios requiring moral credibility and willingness to operate outside official channels. Dakota's hands trembled as she scrolled through hundreds of documents that revealed the scope of the manipulation she'd been subjected to. Her dishonorable discharge from the Air Force hadn't been the result of bureaucratic disapproval. It had been orchestrated by Crosswind operatives who needed her to be available for recruitment when the right crisis emerged. Even more disturbing were the operational plans that showed the Millbrook Nuclear Facility incident hadn't been a false flag operation conducted by rogue military elements. It had been a carefully staged crisis designed specifically to test Dakota's reactions and establish her credibility as someone willing to risk everything to save innocent lives. The 200 hostages had been real, but they'd never been in actual danger. The terrorists holding them had been Crosswind operatives conducting an elaborate psychological experiment to determine whether Dakota could be manipulated into joining their organization. Her heroic attempt to rescue the hostages, her discovery of the government conspiracy, and even her detention and recruitment had all been choreographed events designed to shape her perception of reality. Dr. Chun, Dakota called across the data center to the technical intelligence director who'd become her closest colleague during her time at Crosswind. "I need you to look at something." Jennifer Chun approached Dakota's workstation, her expression shifting from casual interest to alarm as she read the documents displayed on the monitor. "Dakota, where did you get these files?" "From the surveillance aircraft we intercepted last week. The one you told me was conducting unauthorized intelligence collection for foreign governments." Dakota's voice carried the weight of someone discovering that her entire world had been constructed from lies. "Dr. Chen, according to these documents, that aircraft was operated by Crosswind. We intercepted our own surveillance operation." Chun's face went pale as she scrolled through the operational records. "This can't be accurate." Director Walsh briefed us that the aircraft was operated by rogue defense contractors. "Dr. Chun, look at the mission parameters. The aircraft was monitoring my activities in Denver, collecting data on my behavioral patterns and operational effectiveness. We didn't intercept enemy surveillance, we intercepted a performance evaluation." The implications cascaded through Dakota's mind like falling dominoes. If Crosswind had been monitoring her performance during what she'd believed was a legitimate mission, then everything about her recruitment and employment was based on deception. She wasn't a valuable asset fighting government corruption. She was a test subject being studied by the same people who'd orchestrated the crisis that had destroyed her military career. "Jennifer, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. How long have you really been working for Crosswind?" Chun looked around the data center, checking for surveillance equipment that they both knew was omnipresent throughout the facility. "Dakota, we shouldn't be discussing this here. There are protocols designed by people who've been lying to us from the beginning." Dakota stood up from her workstation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally understood the true nature of her situation. "Jennifer, either you're part of this deception, or you're another test subject like me. Which is it?" Chun's composure cracked, revealing the exhaustion of someone who'd been maintaining a carefully constructed facade for too long. "Dakota, I've been with Crosswind for 4 years. I was recruited after my husband was killed in what I was told was a terrorist attack on a CI facility in Syria." "What really happened to your husband?" "According to these files." Chun's voice broke as she gestured toward the monitor displaying Dakota's surveillance records. "He was killed during a Crosswind training exercise that was designed to test my psychological reactions to loss and trauma. His death wasn't collateral damage from a terrorist attack, it was a deliberate murder conducted to determine whether I could be manipulated into joining their organization." The revelation hit Dakota like a physical blow. Crosswind hadn't been recruiting personnel who'd been betrayed by government corruption. They'd been creating the betrayals themselves, systematically destroying the lives of valuable individuals to make them dependent on the organization that had caused their suffering. Jennifer, how many other operatives here have similar stories? All of them. Chun's voice was barely above a whisper. Captain Torres's court-martial for exposing weapon sales to cartels? The weapons were being sold by Crosswind to create a crisis that would justify his recruitment. Agent Morrison's family was killed in what she was told was a random terrorist attack. But according to these files, it was a targeted assassination designed to isolate her emotionally. Dakota felt sick as she understood the scope of the psychological manipulation that had brought her to this facility. Every person she'd met during her time at Crosswind was a victim of carefully orchestrated trauma, designed to break their connection to normal society and make them dependent on an organization that offered purpose and belonging in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. Dr. Chun, what's the real purpose of Project Crosswind? Chun accessed another section of the encrypted files, revealing operational documents that painted a picture of an organization with resources and objectives that transcended normal government authority. Based on what I'm seeing here, Crosswind isn't a government program at all. It's a private intelligence organization that contracts services to multiple governments, corporations, and political entities. The documents showed that Crosswind had conducted operations in dozens of countries, using personnel who believed they were serving American national security interests, when they were actually serving the commercial interests of international clients who paid for specialized services that couldn't be obtained through official channels. Dakota, look at this. Chun highlighted a section of financial records that showed payments from foreign governments, multinational corporations, and political organizations that spanned the entire ideological spectrum. Crosswind has been paid to conduct surveillance on American politicians, assassinate foreign business leaders, and destabilize governments that interfere with client interests. And all of their operatives think they're serving American national security. All of their operatives think they're serving whatever cause justifies their participation. American patriots believe they're fighting government corruption. Foreign nationals believe they're protecting their home countries. Corporate specialists believe they're preventing economic terrorism. Dakota stared at the data streams flowing across multiple monitors, each one representing lives that had been destroyed and rebuilt according to Crosswind's operational requirements. She thought about the nuclear facility in Millbrook, where 200 innocent people had been terrorized to provide psychological conditioning for a recruitment operation. She thought about Jennifer's husband, murdered to create the emotional trauma necessary to make his wife a compliant intelligence asset. Most disturbing of all, she thought about her own recruitment process, which had begun 6 years ago with psychological profiling designed to identify her vulnerabilities and predict her responses to specific stimuli. Her moral courage hadn't made her valuable to Crosswind. It had made her manipulable. Jennifer, what happens now? Do we report this to Director Walsh and hope she's not part of the deception? Dakota, Director Walsh is mentioned throughout these files as the primary architect of psychological manipulation programs. She's been designing recruitment scenarios for 12 years. The scope of their isolation became clear. They were trapped in a facility controlled by people who demonstrated their willingness to murder, torture, and psychologically break anyone who interfered with their operations. Every person they trusted was either a fellow victim or an active participant in the conspiracy. Every mission they'd conducted had been designed to further compromise their moral integrity and increase their dependence on the organization. But as Dakota looked at the evidence of Crosswind's criminal operations spread across the data centers, monitors, she realized that she'd been given something valuable despite the deception. Proof of the conspiracy's scope and methods, documented in the organization's own operational records. Jennifer, how much of this data can we copy without triggering security protocols? All of it, if we're careful. The files are stored on isolated servers that weren't designed to prevent access by technical intelligence personnel. Dakota began transferring the most damaging documents to encrypted storage devices while Chun established secure communication protocols that might allow them to contact outside authorities without Crosswind's knowledge. For the second time in her life, Dakota Riley found herself in possession of evidence that could expose a conspiracy involving the highest levels of government and private sector authority. The question was whether she could survive long enough to make that evidence public, and whether anyone in authority would be willing to act on information that implicated powerful interests in multiple countries. As security alarms began sounding throughout the facility, indicating that their data access had been detected, Dakota realized that her time as a Crosswind operative was about to end as dramatically as her Air Force career had concluded. The difference was that this time she was taking evidence with her. The emergency klaxon screaming through Crosswind's Nevada facility created a sound identical to the ones that had echoed across Millbrook during the staged nuclear crisis. And Dakota realized that even her current escape attempt might be another carefully orchestrated test designed to measure her responses under ultimate pressure. All personnel security breach in Data Center 7, announced Director Walsh's voice over the facility's communication system. Implement lockdown protocols. Detain operatives Riley and Chun for immediate interrogation. Dakota and Jennifer Chun had perhaps 90 seconds before security teams would breach the data centers. Reinforced doors. The encrypted storage devices containing evidence of Crosswind's international conspiracy were downloading terabytes of operational records at a rate that wouldn't complete the transfer for another 3 minutes' time they didn't have. Jennifer, can you establish external communications from here? Chun's fingers flew across multiple keyboards as she attempted to access satellite communication systems that might allow them to transmit evidence to outside authorities. The facility's communication array is hardened against external interference, but there's an emergency broadcast system designed to contact government agencies during crisis situations. Who would we contact? According to these files, Crosswind has operatives or paid assets in every major intelligence agency. The question hung between them as security personnel could be heard moving through the corridors outside the data center. Even if they managed to escape the facility, where could they go with evidence that implicated government officials, corporate executives, and foreign intelligence services in a conspiracy that spanned multiple continents? Dakota, there's something else. Chun highlighted a section of operational records that showed real-time surveillance data from locations around the world. Look at these current mission parameters. Dakota's blood froze as she read deployment orders for Crosswind operatives conducting active operations in 12 countries. American personnel were assassinating political candidates in Eastern Europe. Corporate executives were being eliminated. In South America, government officials who'd opposed certain trade agreements were dying in accidents that the files revealed to be targeted killings. Jennifer, how many people are dying right now because of operations we've been supporting? According to these mission logs, approximately 40 individuals have been eliminated in the past month alone. Politicians, journalists, business leaders, military officers, anyone who interfered with client interests. The scope of the violence made Dakota understand that her moral dilemma had escalated beyond personal survival or career consequences. By working for Crosswind, even unknowingly, she'd been participating in a global murder campaign that eliminated people whose only crime was opposing powerful financial interests. The data center's main door exploded inward as security teams deployed. Shaped charges that turned reinforced steel into twisted metal. Armed personnel in tactical gear swept into the room with the coordinated efficiency of special operations forces, their weapons trained on Dakota and Chun with lethal precision. Hands visible, no sudden movements, ordered the team leader, a scarred man Dakota recognized as the contractor who'd transported her from the Colorado detention facility. Director Walsh wants to speak with you personally. As they were escorted through corridors lined with sophisticated monitoring equipment, Dakota noticed details that revealed the true scope of Crosswind's operations. Multiple command centers, displayed global communications intercepts. Technical laboratories contained prototype weapon systems that exceeded anything she'd seen during her military service. Personnel from dozens of countries worked alongside Americans in what appeared to be an international intelligence fusion center. Director Walsh waited in a conference room that overlooked the facility's airfield, where advanced aircraft sat ready for deployment to crisis zones around the world. Her expression combined disappointment with the calculating assessment of someone determining whether to salvage or discard valuable assets. Miss Riley, Dr. Chun, I'm disappointed that your intellectual curiosity has created complications for operations that serve essential national security interests. Director Walsh, Dakota replied, according to your own files, Crosswind has been murdering American citizens and foreign nationals to serve commercial interests rather than national security. Walsh activated a holographic display that showed global political and economic data streams, with overlay graphics indicating Crosswind's influence on international events. Miss Riley, what you call murder, I call conflict prevention. Every individual eliminated by our operations was planning actions that would have resulted in wars, economic collapses, or political instabilities that would have killed thousands of innocent people. The rationalization was delivered with the conviction of someone who'd spent years justifying increasingly extreme measures in service of abstract greater goods. Dakota recognized the mindset from her own military service, the gradual progression from protecting American lives to protecting American interests to protecting whatever objectives required justification. Director Walsh, who decides which people need to die for the greater good? Our clients, Miss Riley. Governments, corporations, and international organizations that understand the complexity of maintaining global stability in an era when traditional diplomatic and economic tools are insufficient. Jennifer Chun stepped forward, her voice carrying the pain of someone who'd finally understood how her husband's death had been justified. Director Walsh, my husband was killed because he discovered evidence of weapon sales to terrorist organizations. What greater good did his murder serve? Dr. Chun, your husband's investigation would have exposed operations that were providing intelligence on terrorist weapon purchases to multiple government agencies. His misguided sense of moral obligation would have compromised sources and methods that have prevented dozens of attacks on civilian populations. The explanation was plausible enough to demonstrate how Crosswind recruited intelligent people by offering moral justifications for participation in criminal activities. Every operation could be rationalized as serving some higher purpose, preventing some greater tragedy, protecting some innocent population from consequences they couldn't understand. Dakota looked through the conference room's windows at the aircraft waiting on the facility's runway, including an F-35B Lightning II identical to the one she'd crashed during her unauthorized mission to Millbrook. The sight triggered a memory of Carmen Martinez asking if the bad men were going to hurt her family, a question that had seemed simple when the bad men were foreign terrorists rather than American intelligence operatives. Director Walsh, what happens now? Do you eliminate us like you eliminated everyone else who discovered inconvenient truths? Walsh smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who'd convinced hundreds of people to participate in their own manipulation. Miss Riley, elimination is wasteful when rehabilitation is possible. You and Dr. Chun represent significant investments in training and psychological conditioning. Our preference is to address your concerns through additional mission assignments. That will demonstrate the necessity of our methods. The offer was more sophisticated than the crude recruitment pitch Dakota had received in the detention facility. Instead of threatening her with prosecution, Walsh was offering her the chance to participate in operations that would gradually compromise her moral objections through incremental involvement in increasingly questionable activities. What kind of mission assignments? Beginning with the elimination of individuals who pose immediate threats to Crosswind's operational security. People who've acquired sensitive information about our methods and personnel. Walsh activated another display showing surveillance photographs of journalists, government investigators, and intelligence analysts who'd apparently gotten too close to discovering Crosswind's activities. Dakota recognized several of the faces from news reports about suspicious accidents and unexplained disappearances. The pattern was clear. Anyone who investigated Crosswind became a target for elimination, which meant that her current situation was a familiar script that had been played out dozens of times with other operatives who discovered inconvenient truths. Director Walsh, you're asking us to murder people whose only crime is doing their jobs too effectively. Miss Riley, I'm asking you to prevent the exposure of operations that protect millions of innocent lives from consequences they can't imagine. Sometimes individual sacrifice is necessary to serve the greater good. The phrase greater good had become a justification for every atrocity in human history. Dakota realized. Every genocide, every political purge, every war crime had been justified by someone who claimed to understand necessities that ordinary moral judgment couldn't comprehend. But as she looked at Jennifer Chun, who'd lost her husband to Crosswind's version of the greater good, Dakota understood that some choices were simple despite their complexity. Some actions were wrong regardless of their justifications. Some people needed to be stopped even if stopping them required personal sacrifice. Director Walsh, I have a counter-proposal. I'm listening, Miss Riley. Go to hell. The conference room erupted into chaos as Dakota lunged across the table toward Walsh while Chun simultaneously activated an emergency transmitter that began broadcasting their stolen evidence to every satellite communication system within range. Security personnel converged on both women with lethal force authorization, but not before Chun managed to complete the data transmission that would expose Crosswind's operations to intelligence agencies, news organizations, and government oversight. Committees in 37 countries. As consciousness faded under the impact of a security officer's baton, Dakota's last coherent thought was that she'd finally found the answer to Carmen Martinez's question about whether the bad men were going to hurt her family. The bad men had been hurting everyone's family for years. But now, finally, someone was going to hurt them back. The story that began with a diner waitress landing an F-35 to save her town was ending with that same waitress sacrificing everything to save the world from people who justified murder with mathematics and genocide with good intentions. Whether that sacrifice would matter, whether the evidence would survive, whether anyone with authority would act on information that threatened powerful interests, those questions would be answered by other people in other places, making their own choices about courage and conscience. Dakota Riley's part in the story was over. What happened next would determine whether her sacrifice had any meaning, or whether she'd simply become another casualty in a war that most people didn't know was being fought. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.